I'm going to kick off today's show by sharing a little bit about the unspoken war in a place called Tigray. I'll just share my screen with you here super quick. So, just to give you an idea of where this location actually is. So, you look at the Horn of Africa here in Somalia, and here's the entrance to the Red Sea, and here's the Persian Gulf up there. And Ethiopia sits over here with Djibouti right there at the mouth of the Red Sea. And Tigray is here in this red dotted line there. So, it's the northernmost state or province, if you like, of Ethiopia. And what had happened is there's a force here that were arguing with Eritrea on this side and Ethiopia here on this side, and they're arguing about independence. And if you know anything about this part of the world, these folks had been at war with each other all through the 1980s, and it's a very, very nasty part of the world, and they're fighting with each other for one reason or another. Ed, you would have remembered the famine in Ethiopia. Remember that? So that was a result of the warring parties that had been going on since the late 1970s into the early 80s. Now, why do I raise this ray of sight of sunshine here on today's Unspoken Truth? Well, the reason that I raise it is because nobody in mainstream media is talking about it. The United Nations never really spoke about it, and nobody in your government ever informed you that something like this was going on. And the unspoken truth is that these poor people in Africa don't seem to produce anything of value to the world. And it seems to me like the people that are in power, meaning the WEF and the UN and the International Monetary Fund, all of the people that hold all of the purse strings, look at conflicts like this and just kind of shrug their shoulders and go, well, what do we care? That we're not getting anything out of these people. But the truth of the matter is that more than 600,000 civilians were killed there. And the way that they were killed was they were starved. It's estimated between 50 and 100,000 civilians were killed in kinetic action, meaning from the actual conflict itself. But the remainder of that were killed as a result of starvation. And what the government had done on both sides, and the Eritrea side and the Ethiopian side, they were encircling that state and those people, and they just starved them out. But in the process of starving their military out, they starved the population out at the same time. It would be no different to you there in Minnesota, Ed. There was a group of vigilantes that came along and said, we don't like the government anymore, and started fighting the government. And the government turned around and said, all right, no worries. If you want to fight us, we're not really going to fight back. We'll fight back if we have to defend ourselves. But what we're going to do is close the borders, and nothing can come in or come out. And you're only going to survive for a given amount of time. But this went on for 2 years, and it only ended in November of 2022. So you sort of think, how can 600,000 people, civilians that is, die over that period of time and you not hear about it? Well, the reality is we know that all conflict is perpetuated by a narrative. And if you look at the narrative of the war of Ukraine, you sort of see it and you say, well, they seem to be giving them just enough weapon systems to hold the ground, just enough, but they're not being decisive. And I was thinking about this earlier as I was going through my Telegram earlier before I jumped on the call here. As I was looking through my Telegram, I saw the Dutch Prime Minister or Dutch President saying that he was going to hand over F-16s to Ukraine. And okay, now the time has come. We've got the logistics in place. We're going to do that. You're going to get your jets. There you go. Off you go. That'll be a decisive thing that actually happens. And I thought to myself, all of these countries, these NATO countries, they're in this alliance. They're all trying to protect themselves. All the weapon systems that they have, they're there designed to defend themselves. But they're there to defend themselves against the outside enemy, who was always Russia. And now we're at war with Russia. They're holding on to all of their weapon systems. It doesn't make any sense. And that's why the Brits, in some way, have been leading the way with weapons, saying that, okay, they've came out yesterday and said, we said a while back we're going to give you long-range strike missiles, but now we're going to give them to you. So we see this narrative that's being perpetuated where there's just enough weapon systems to hold the Russians at bay, but to also decimate the Russian economy and the Russian military at the same time. Now, when you juxtapose that over the top of Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Tigray, and these places that you've never heard of, you probably can't point to on a map, what I think is that because nothing is happening in that part of the world that contributes to the worldwide economy, those people are just forgotten. There is no narrative to perpetuate. So the narrative that we perpetuate is none. No one's to report on that. You to be quiet about that. We don't want to hear about it. And if we just look across the way a little bit, now in Sudan, there's all sorts of fighting going on there as well. And there's literally hundreds of thousands of people that are leaving that part of the world. And it shows me that the people in charge are not really the people in charge. It's the unspoken truth is that your prime minister, your president, your foreign affairs minister, or the people that are responsible for communicating what's going on in the world and helping the people that need help in the world don't care about these African nations. They don't care about them. But those people are just as important as you and me. Those people are entitled to freedom, to healthcare. They're entitled to live a life and to have a job and to do whatever it is that they want to do. But they're held back by the unknown narrative, the unknown forces of the world. So when there's no narrative to be perpetuated, there's literally no narrative. And those people are they're put on the back burner into irrelevance. So to them, to the WEF, those African nations warring with each other are irrelevant. The United Nations, irrelevant. The United Nations is the most impotent body on planet Earth and should be dissolved and gotten rid of immediately. How did we have the Russians chairing the last United Nations meeting and they're breaking all of the UN rules? And if you ever see the Russians in the United Nations, they're the most arrogant, hypocritical people that you could ever possibly think. So I even, and they're so like antagonistic when they're there. You're like, why are you even here? So I'm meandering a lot in this sort of monologue here, but I'm deliberately meandering because I'm trying to show you the unspoken truth that when there's something to be gained, then it's all through the media and it's all on the lips of your leadership in your country. The Australian government didn't send a brass razoo to anybody in Ethiopia that needed help. They're not sending any money to anybody in Sudan to help anybody. Well, if they are, you certainly don't know about it. And is the American government doing it? Well, maybe via the CIA, because the CIA are in there trying to control the places politically, and they're trying to sort out what needs to be sorted out in the best interests of the United States, because that's what the CIA do when they're abroad, right? So they might be responsible for all of it. They might be responsible for what's going on behind it, but they may not have anything to do with it. The point is, you don't know. And the reason you don't know is because it's not relevant and there is no narrative to perpetuate because there's no money associated with it and there's nothing to be gained. But the reality is, folks, the unspoken truth is that more than 600,000 civilians were killed in that war in Ethiopia in 2 years. It's incredible what happened there. And it's estimated that another 200 to 300,000 soldiers were killed on both sides as well. So the numbers are edging up around a million people. But when you start talking about 100,000 people here or there, what difference does it make? It's just an absolute tragedy of a scale that you couldn't possibly comprehend. And, it's not happening over a large country like Ukraine. It's happening in a small province, a state-sized province. So the suffering and the magnitude of suffering is beyond what you could possibly comprehend. And even though there's now a ceasefire in place and that's been holding since November of last year, there's still deep divides. They still haven't solved the underlying issues that were there. And there's an opportunity and a chance for this to kick off again, and kick off again at a scale where this time the government are not going to stand for any of it. And they go in there and roll them all up properly, and they just completely and totally decimate the place. At the start of that conflict, and I'll round out with this just to highlight the hypocrisy of mainstream media and to highlight the unspoken truth. At the start of that conflict, there was a massacre that happened there where more than 600 civilians were killed in one place at one time. Imagine if that happened in Ukraine. Imagine that if that happened in downtown Amsterdam or downtown Brisbane. That would be mainstream news for the next 2 years, and there'd be, people bleeding hearts everywhere. But it happens in Africa, and everybody just shrugs their shoulders, and nobody hears about it. But imagine if there was a massacre where there was 600 people killed in one day by military civilians. It's like the scale of this is just beyond what you could possibly comprehend. And once again, folks, the whole reason that this show exists is to pull the curtain back and show you the truth behind what's going on in the narrative there. And if you'd never heard of this war in Ethiopia or this place called Tigray, then I encourage you to go and look on behalf of those people that suffered. So you need to be educated about these things so these things don't keep happening. And that's the reason. That's part of the reason that I keep talking about these things. That's part of the reason I like history so much, because the historical precedent that is set gives us a framework for what is coming. They say that history repeats itself, but I don't think history repeats itself. The better way of saying that, the better way of using that saying is history rhymes. We've seen what's going on in Europe right now with the Russians and the Ukrainians. We saw that happening with the Germans and everybody else in World War II. It's really no different. History is not repeating itself. Germany is not invading anybody. I'm not saying that for 1 minute. But what I am saying is that history rhymes. And the Russians are doing the same things of what the Germans were doing. And they're using similar justifications to what the Germans did back in World War II. And I'm not comparing them. What I'm doing is showing you that history rhymes. And if you look back through the conflicts, and if you look back through how communism and socialism tried to take over during the 20th century, you will see that each time that was tried, it failed. And each time it went on, it was very similar to the time that it happened before. So hopefully, folks, you've learned a little bit about Ethiopia and Tigray, and hopefully you take a couple of minutes just to Google that to see exactly what happened, because I think it's worthwhile looking at, as hard as it is to look at, because you need to learn those lessons. And if we can just take one or two people at a time, if one person learns one